A wonderful Tuesday morning to you all, and welcome to Cozy Horror. With me, Dr. Plague. Let's get you 5 more great stories so that you can have a little fun this Tuesday. Today's topic of discussion are writers and artists and creatives in general, and the price they sometimes pay for their work. Let's get things started with a couple of writers talking about an odd occurrence in their dreams and what that might mean for their future. Let's talk about the price of success. Reggie had the same ritual before bed every night. Shower at 8, pajamas on at 8:10, white noise machine on at 8:15, sleep mask on at 8:30, weighted blanket pulled up to his chin at 8:35, eyes closed, and thinking peaceful thoughts by 8:45. All this was so he could be in the most receptive state by 8:45, so he could slip into the door dream. Reggie had been having the door dream since he was a kid. Kids he knew had weird dreams. Tommy Terry had told him that he dreamed he was a spaceman in a ship made out of macaroni. But Reggie only ever had the one dream. In the dream, he was floating in space, and there was a weird cord, something he would later learn was called an umbilical cord, stretching from his stomach out into space. It was like an astronaut's oxygen line, but Reggie didn't have a spacesuit. Reggie in the dreams was always naked. That would have been a little scary to a kid his age, but it seemed normal in the dream. He just floated out into oblivion, and eventually he came to the door. The door, capital D, was sitting on a little planet. The planet was so small that Reggie could have walked around it in 6 long strides. The planet was green with dirt and a little grass, but it was hardly the most important thing there. No, the most important thing there was the door. The door stood about 18 or 20 feet tall, and it was wider than Reggie could stretch both arms out, even as an adult. At first, the door had scared Reggie. He had tried to jump back out into space and get away from it. He could do that. He had done that for a while. But after returning to the door night after night, Reggie got curious. He remembered the first night he had gone to stand beside it. The first night he had heard the whispers. The whispers should have scared him too. It made the hairs climb up on his neck, but as he edged closer to the door, he realized it wasn't the scary whispers like his brother's horror movies had. It wasn't even the mean whispers that grown-ups did sometimes. It was whispering stories, the kind of stories Mom sometimes read at bedtime. It wasn't stories about the Berenstain Bears or Little Critter, though. These were stories like Treasure Island or King Arthur and his knights. Reggie went from being scared to enthralled as he listened, and he came back every night for more stories. Then, one day, he used one of the stories for Mrs. Macy's writing class. She loved it. She praised his creativity, and Reggie decided from then on to use more of them. There were never any consequences. No one ever accused him of plagiarism as he wrote. Reggie discovered that he could add little things to make them his own, too. The stories were amazing and so vast and well done, and as Reggie grew up, the stories grew with him. Soon, it wasn't just school assignments. Reggie was submitting the stories to magazines, to contests, and even expanding them into books. He didn't blow up overnight, but his stories on Reddit and on other smaller writing communities gained him a following. People were hungry for his work long before he was on the shelves of Barnes & Noble or Amazon, and his star only grew as he continued to write. Reggie, however, never thought of himself as a writer. Reggie was chronicling the stories he heard when he slept. "How do you do it, Reggie?" Klein asked one afternoon as they ate lunch outside of Manny's Bar and Grill. "How do you consistently turn out these amazing stories?" Manny had the best barbecue in the city, in Reggie's opinion, and as he wiped grease off his chin and sauce off his collar, he shrugged. I sleep, mostly. Klein raised an eyebrow at him. Sleep? That's your big advice for a struggling writer? Klein was a playwright, and he'd been having a lot of trouble finishing his latest opus. Yep, Reggie said, through a mouthful of rib meat. A good night's sleep and the right dreams, I suppose. Klein raised an eyebrow. What exactly do you mean by that? Reggie went right on eating, not in a big hurry to share his process. He had never told anyone about the door, no one he could remember anyway. He'd always been very careful about it, not wanting anyone else to find out. What if one night he just showed up and there was a group of people there stealing his stories? Reggie couldn't have that. He had a very cushy life thanks to these stories, and he wanted to keep it that way. Klein blew out a breath. I hate when you do that. Do what? Reggie asked, laughing. You guard your process so closely. You always have. We've been friends since college, Reggie. I don't know about you, but that means something to me. If you were in a pickle like this, I'd sure share my process with you. Reggie rolled his eyes. Klein could be so dramatic, but when he told him so, Klein made a disgusted noise and stormed off. Suit yourself, Reginald, but when I am homeless and living on the street, you will have only yourself to blame when you have to eat brunch alone. Reggie shook his head and went back to eating. His process was no one's business but his own, and no matter how much he liked Klein, he wouldn't risk it. He needed the door, was wholly dependent on the door, and he couldn't keep his quota without it. If ever Reggie had been a real writer, it was now gone. These days, he was little more than a ventriloquist who listened to a very talented dummy. Reggie was at his apartment later, writing the sequel to his latest ode opera, when someone knocked. It was Klein again, and he was a mess. Klein was always kind of dramatic and ostentatious, but today he looked like a raccoon caught in the rain. He'd been crying, that much was obvious, and his usually well-coiffed hair was a mess. Reggie invited him in, putting his tale of two cowboys seeking their opportunity in the Sierra Nevadas aside, and asked him what was going on. The more he reflected on his outburst at brunch, the less it seemed like the usual melodrama from his friend. Mr. Caspian has given me an ultimatum, he sniffed, and suddenly Reggie got it. Victor Caspian, head of the Thespian Society, and grade A bastard, was one of the biggest contributors to the arts in the borough. He was also the one who organized the spring and fall production, and could be extremely temperamental. He and Klein had a love-hate relationship, but Klein often depended on Mr. Caspian, buying his scripts so he could pay his bills and fund his lifestyle of starving avant-garde socialite. He says if my play isn't ready by the end of the week, then he won't be using my work for the spring production. Reggie shrugged. Well, there's always the fall production. Klein shot him a dark look. What he said was he wouldn't be using it for any production. A black mark from Victor Caspian could ruin me. I need his patronage, Reggie. Help me, please. Reggie shook his head, though not in negation. Klein, you know I'm not good at stage plays. How much do you lack being done? Just the end, Klein said, nearly leaping to his feet. I just have the ending number and the closing to write, and it's done. The problem is that when it comes to the closer, I can't figure out how to come up with it. I need help, Reggie. Please help me out. What do you want me to do? Reggie asked, not patronizingly, but serious. I know less about songwriting than playwriting, and that's saying something. Well, you were talking technique earlier. Help me with my technique. You write so much, Reggie. Where does it all come from? Maybe if I could get into that headspace, I could come up with an ending. Please, Reggie, I'm desperate here. Reggie put his head in his hands. Screw it. Maybe if only Klein knew about it, then it wouldn't be so bad. Klein and he could share it, so long as Klein kept his damn mouth shut. Klein would do that much. Reggie had to believe that. He didn't think he'd blab about it. It's not really a process. I really do just get ideas in my sleep. Klein started to get up in a huff, clearly thinking he was being pushed off, but Reggie grabbed his arm and drew him back down. Look, sleeping is exactly what I do for my process. Remember how you're always fussing at me because I don't stay up late for parties all the time? Yes, Klein said testily. It usually means I have to go with Tanya, and you know what a bore she is. Well, I do it because I often get my best ideas in my dreams. I lie down and my mind just wanders off as I sleep. It goes to a peaceful place and I find my stories there. It's nothing technical. It's nothing I'm taking or using. It's just sleep. Klein looked skeptical. His face softened a little as he realized that Reggie was being serious. Is that all? Just sleep? Well, Reggie said, deciding to share a little more. Picture something that gives you the stories. Like what? Klein asked, leaning in closer. Reggie leaned in closer too, not wanting anyone to hear. Well, ever since I was a kid, mine's always been a big door. It's like someone, or lots of someones, are whispering the stories under the door. I make little changes, and I make them my own. Klein smirked, expecting Reggie to scoff and say he was teasing. But when he didn't, Klein's smirk slipped off. You're serious, aren't you? Reggie nodded and took him to see his process, even offered to let him use his bed if he wanted to. Klein took it all in, looking slightly skeptical, but he agreed. He went through Reggie's routine, bedded down while the sun was still a line on the horizon, and Reggie went to sleep on the couch. There was no door for him that night, but when Reggie saw Klein the next day, the man looked changed. He looked like Scrooge at the end of A Christmas Carol. He looked changed, and not entirely for the better. I understand now, he half whispered. I see what needs to be done now. Klein, Reggie said. He didn't think the man was going to stop for a moment. You can't tell anyone about this. Uh-huh, he said, but Reggie got up and stopped him before he could leave. Kleinhammer Marshall, and his actual name seemed to snap him out of it a little bit. You cannot tell a soul about this door. Do you understand? No one. Not a person. Klein looked up at him. Reggie didn't doubt the words that he said. Of course not. I don't want anyone else to know about this. It could ruin it. Reggie nodded, content in the knowledge that Klein would keep his secret. Klein kept it all right. He kept it till the day he died. That year's spring production was masterful, but it wasn't what Reggie had been looking at whenever Klein showed him snippets of what he was working on. It was a dark comedy, almost devoid of song and leaning heavily into the surreal. Caspian loved it, couldn't praise Klein enough, and Reggie began to notice that Klein went out less and less at night. When he asked about the play, Klein said he had scrapped what he had been working on and wrote the new piece in a 48-hour frantic pace. It was what the door said I should write, he said, his voice taking on a hollow sound when he spoke about it. Reggie kept using the door, noticing no negative effects from talking about it, and he didn't think much about it again until the Seattle conference, 3 years after Klein wrote his award-winning play. He was sitting in the dining area of the Marriott Hotel, taking advantage of their continental breakfast, before another day of convention panels, when a man came to sit with him. You're Reginald Foster, he said, offering a hand. It's a pleasure. I'm Jeffrey Dost. Reggie nearly spat eggs on the man. Really? The Jeffrey Dost, who wrote the Crystal Tower series. He wanted to call BS, but the man did look like the photo on the back of the book. If the guy was cosplaying, then he was doing a damn good job. One and the same. I wanted to talk to you about something that might sound a little weird. Reggie swallowed and nodded slowly. Sure, whatever you want. I wish I had my copy of Drassel's Step. I'd love an autograph. I've got one in the back of my car. If you'll give me 20 minutes, I'll sign it for you tonight if you like. I have a feeling we're going to be at the same convention after all. Reggie laughed, but something in the old man's face told him he wasn't likely to want the book later. Something told him that despite meeting his idol, a man whose books had been a backdrop for his childhood, he wasn't going to like what Mr. Doss had to say. I'll just come right out and ask it, Mr. Doss said, steepling his fingers. You've seen the door, haven't you? Whatever Reggie had been expecting him to say, it wasn't that. How do you know about the door? He asked, unable to stop himself. Lots of us do. Quite a few of us have seen the door. It speaks to us, and we use its stories to make comfortable livings for ourselves. I love your books, but the second I started reading them, I could tell that you had seen and heard it. You've done well, like most of us, but I have to warn you that taking them comes with a price. A price? Reggie asked, not sure what he meant. The door doesn't tell you, but those stories aren't free. I didn't understand it either. Not until my friend Leonard died. Leon Rothschild, he paused. And when Reggie didn't show recognition, he went on. Got a lot of his stories from the door. He wrote most of his series that way, and he was a celebrated sci-fi writer for decades. He was my writing mentor. A man who took me under his wing and showed me the ropes. And when he died, I was distraught. I didn't write for nearly a year, but it wasn't until I went back to the door that I noticed the change. I was listening to the whispers at the door when I heard him. He stopped, his face getting that look that people associate with seeing ghosts. He was there, behind the door. I could hear him, telling me the stories he never got to tell. I called his name, asked him how he was in there, but he wouldn't say anything, except the stories the door wanted him to tell. After that, I started listening closer. Have you ever heard of Earl Bean? Of course. He wrote the Minor Major novels that were popular in the 70s, Reggie said. I recognized his voice, too. I was watching an old interview of his for a highlight reel, and I realized that he was the one who was telling me the Crystal Tower stories since I was 20 years old. He was the voice that gave them to me. And there were others, too. So many others in there. And they just keep growing. I heard Edward Carter in there the other day. Tracy Morris, too. I've heard so many others, old friends and people I admired. And I knew then that I had to help people. Help? Reggie asked. How would you? It doesn't seem to matter. It does, though, Mr. Doss said. I hope it does, at least. I think that maybe if you stop using it, then your time in it becomes less. I don't know. It's difficult to say. I stopped using the door about 6 years ago, right after Leon died. I have friends, however, who refuse to stop. One of them told me that he can't hear Leon anymore. I remember him saying that Leon would only use the door when he was really stumped, so maybe he only used it sparingly. Regardless, I just thought you should be warned, he said, getting up and collecting his cup. Whether you use it or not, it seems like the right thing to do. He spent the weekend thinking about what Doss had said, but the real surprise was waiting for him when he got back. The voicemail when he got off the plane was tragic. Klein had been in a car accident, a bad one, and he hadn't made it. He died about halfway through Reggie's flight, and that was when it all came home for Reggie. What if Doss had been right? What if Reggie went to that door and heard his old friend Klein telling him stories? He was sitting in bed that night, the ritual of starting ingrained, but as he lay awake in his bed, Reggie didn't think he could do it. He lay there that night, waiting for sleep, dreading what voices he might hear from that massive door. If you should see that door in your own dreams tonight, what voices might speak to you from beneath it? Should you listen? Would you pay the price?
As a writer myself, I can always tell you there is a price to be paid in the end. Moving from writers to artists, let's see what truly lies in the mind of an artist.
Oh, good. You're awake. Don't struggle too much. I know what this looks like, but I promise I'm not going to kill you. Your rope's too tight? I can loosen them a little. Sadly, the gag has to stay on. You see, I can't have you interrupting me while I create my masterpiece, or while I tell you how we came to be here. Do you recognize me? No? Maybe you're not an art lover. My name is Roland DePriest, and I'm a world-renowned artist. My work has been seen in galleries, museums, and was once the showcase of any place it was housed. The critics said my eye for color and my ability to capture the human condition in a simple brushstroke was astonishing, even peerless. I had the ear of the world, and whatever I painted turned to gold. It was to be expected, of course. Are you sure your hands aren't too tight? I can loosen them a little. All right, if you're sure. I'd offer you something to drink, but all I have is wine, and I dare say it might react badly to the sedatives I gave you earlier. Come on, don't act upset. I told you I'm not going to hurt you. Where was I? Ah, my rise to fame. My genius was to be expected, after all. From a young age, I showed sublime talent with the brush. I had an eye for detail, and a notable presence on the canvas. I was soon invited to study at some of the greatest art schools in the world, where my talent was honed and molded by some of the greatest artistic minds of our time. I debuted my first serious piece when I was 13 years old. By the time I was 14, I had my first gallery showing, and for my 18th birthday, I was honored to have one of my paintings hung in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, alongside the greatest works of our time. It didn't stop there, though. My work was hung in the Louvre in France, the Acropolis Museum in Greece, and even the Prada in Madrid. Every serious art critic said they wished they could see in my mind, so they might glimpse my genius firsthand. For several years, I was the toast of the art world. Sadly, though, it only made my fall more spectacular. What? What's wrong? Why do you look so scared? Oh, but of course, I guess it's a little disconcerting to see a man who's kidnapped you holding a gun. Don't weep so. Tonight, this gun is my brush, and the walls of this basement are my canvas. For the love of God, stop struggling. Tonight, you're going to be part of history, and you're shaking and flailing like I'm a wild animal. Now you've made me lose my train of thought. Where was I? Ah, yes, my fall from grace. It wasn't a lapse in my talent, you understand. My genius never wavered. But these Philistines grew bored with my work. The critics, men who had once praised me as a genius, now saw my art as overdone, reminiscent of earlier works. They wrote articles about how I had peaked at 20, about how I should be proud of my accomplishments, how I should cease to embarrass myself by continuing this sad campaign. They, again, wrote how they wished they could get a look inside my head, the mind of the artist, so they could see where it all went so wrong. I tried modern art, living art, interpretive art, but it all amounted to the same thing. The loving eye of the public had turned from me. And now, it's come to this. Why do you continue to struggle and weep? I've already told you that I'm not going to hurt you. No. Your job is to tell the world about my latest work. You're the herald of my genius, and you must tell the art world what I cannot. Listen to the sound the cylinder makes when I spin it. Such a smooth sound, isn't it? You see, my friend, I've decided to give the art community just what it always wanted. If they want to see what's inside the mind of an artist so badly, then they're going to love my last piece. Ah, there they are. I can hear the sirens outside now. I called the police 10 minutes ago, told them where to find us. It will take them another few minutes to break down the door and make their way to the basement. But it'll be too late by then. I'm going to remove your gag now, so you can help them discover my latest art piece. And remember, a call the mind of an artist.
Poor Roland. It's a good thing that his last piece of art resurfaces in a few stories. Coming up next, we have a tale about a strange writing muse and the odd way that a writer finds it throughout his life. Let's hear a story about The Door.
I met my husband when we were in college together. I was working on my bachelor's degree, helping out in the library for some needed extra cash, when I first laid eyes on him. He was not the usual sort of man I fancied, more bookish than muscly. I found him charming in his own way, and we struck up a friendship. He told me he was a writer, that he was working on a book of short stories to submit to a publishing house. I offered to read them, and from that moment on, I became his biggest fan. His stories were so visceral. He wrote not as a writer, but as a first-hand observer, and it wasn't long before his work was noticed. We were living together by then, our library friendship having blossomed into something more, and I could see how giddy he was when the letters came in from Bowding Publishing. When he read how they wanted to publish his book, I think it was the proudest moment of his life. He kept writing for Bowding, his stories finding a niche with the horror community. He also started selling his pieces to magazines and online sources, getting his name out there and becoming more recognizable. As his fame grew, however, he still jokingly called me his biggest fan. I couldn't argue with him. I genuinely loved his work. He wrote the sort of stories that were genuinely terrifying and enticed the reader to keep reading until the very end. As his stories grew in number, I found myself curious about where they all came from. My husband, we'll call him Michael, was a mild-mannered fellow who had never really experienced anything horrifying in his life. He described his childhood as benign, no broken bones or funny uncles. His family was loving and doted on him constantly. He had never been without. He had never really suffered, and I found myself very curious about where all these nightmares came from in such a beautiful mind. Then, over drinks one night, he told me. He didn't like to talk about, where he got the stories from, not when he was sober. He always said that discussing the creative process was boring, or that his story's technical aspects would bore me to tears. I wasn't fooled, though. Beneath his jokes was something colder, something fearful. So one night I pressed him. He still didn't really want to talk about it, but I persisted. Finally, after a lot of coaxing and some strong whiskey, he all but blurted his answer to me. I wish now that I hadn't asked. "It's the door," he said, and at that moment he seemed almost afraid of his own words. The door? I was confused by the queerness of his answer. What do you dream about? He asked the question so suddenly, I was taken by surprise. Oh, I don't know. Normal things, I guess. What I did the day before, movies I've watched, weird things my mind cooks up. I've only ever had the same dream my entire life.
It's always the same. It never changes. It's where I get all my ideas. I leaned forward, intrigued by what he was telling me. He seemed emboldened by my attention. The door lies in space. At least I believe it must be space. It floats in a great void, and every night I visit it. I float through this void naked, an umbilicus connecting me to whatever lies beyond. Every night I approach the door, and every night it whispers to me through the keyhole. Do you remember the little journal on my bedside? I nodded, begging him to go on with my eyes. I've trained myself to write the things I hear while sleeping. Sometimes I see pictures or faces when I look through the keyhole. Sometimes I hear terrible words spoken by creatures I imagine to be beyond my description. Sometimes I have to close my eyes and will myself awake because I'm afraid that the things they tell me will drive me insane. When I wake up, I read what I've written down, which becomes my stories. I was shocked. So all your stories come from this big door in space? He smiled at me. It sounds silly when you say it like that, but yes, everything I've ever written was spoken to me by something on the other side of that door. I didn't think anything of it the next day. We'd been drunk, and he had just spouted off something to make me shut up. I was sure of it. I became more aware of his journal, though. Sometimes at night he would wake me up with the scritch-scratch of his pen on the page. I didn't like to look at him when he was writing it. It was like something otherworldly had taken his strings and was using him without his permission. Watching him write in that fugue state made me feel uncomfortable, and I took measures not to be awake while it was going on. I didn't think anything else of this, not until about 3 months ago. That was when he started having the nightmares. His work had always been creepy, always terrifying, but now it took on an alarming quality. He began talking about creatures that lived beyond the door. These creatures sounded more than a little Lovecraftian, and he was assured that their presence on Earth was an affront to the natural order. They came and went, their arrivals marked by some with great portents, and their battles had shaped history. The stories weren't the only thing that changed, though. He began to sleep poorly. His sleep had always been placid, peaceful, but now he thrashed and mumbled in his sleep. He whimpered in the night about the pale lady or the green man and the riotous red that surged like blood. The words he wrote in his journal were unreadable, a foreign language, but he sat and scribbled them, transcribed them every morning like a dutiful follower of some religion. He began to change. His eyes bore huge bags. He was jumpy and unsure of himself, and more than once I caught him catnapping fitfully during the day. His writing, however, was more in demand than ever. The magazines he wrote for wanted more stories about these strange old ones. His editor wanted to publish a compilation of them at once. He had no lack of material for the book, but I began to get worried about his health as he proceeded. We had been married for 2 years then, just starting to make a life together, and I was afraid that his candle would burn out before mine. I asked him one night to stop writing the stories. He was at his computer, typing away dutifully, when I made the request. He turned his head to look at me, haunted eyes boring into mine, and laughed for the first time in weeks. It wasn't his laugh, though. The laughter was jagged and full of despair, humor shared only by the damned. He laughed like a madman. I can't. If I stop writing, they won't like it. Who? I asked in confusion. The ones behind the door. They've marked me as their chronicler. I can't stop until the job is done. These things are killing you. Can't you see that, Michael? He slumped over his keyboard, resting his head against it, making a line of letters as he did so. Don't you think I would if I could? If I could stop, I would give so much to stop. The things they tell me, no one should have to know these things. It's fruit from the poison tree, and I wish I did not have the knowledge that they've given me. Then stop, I said suddenly. Just stop writing. Tell them you refuse to write their story. He looked horrified. Refuse them? I've never refused a story before. What if What if it stops the door from working? I turned him in his chair and pulled him to me. The door is in your mind, love. The way it manifests is nothing more than your own mind working through your stories. The monsters are of your own making. You control them. They don't control you. At that moment, he looked relieved. He hugged me back and seemed on the verge of tears. I don't think he had ever thought of those nightly excursions as anything but in a literal sense. He had never imagined that these things could be of his own creation, and the knowledge had made him feel free. I'll tell them tonight, then, he said with a smile on his face. I'll tell them that I don't want to write about them anymore. I'll tell Fred that I don't want to continue these stories in the morning. He won't like it, but he'll understand. He went to bed then, and I figured that would be the end of the nightmares. I was wrong. He woke me in the middle of the night, screaming. The back of his hand hit me in the face, and I rolled awake to the sound of him screaming. He was thrashing around, clutching his stomach and kicking his legs frantically. I tried to wake him. I know everything says not to do that, but I wanted him to wake up. I slapped his face. I threw water on him. I screamed his name, but nothing worked. Someone banged on the door, but I ignored them. I tried in every way I could to help my husband. Finally, he helped himself. We were in the ER. The knocking person had called the paramedics, and they had burst in. They thought someone was being murdered, but they loaded him up and took him straight to the hospital when they saw what was going on. He lay in an ER bed, screaming and kicking until they finally restrained him. He went right on thrashing and yelling until nearly 4 a.m. Then he gasped loudly, like a diver coming up from a deep depth, and seemed to come awake. "They cut my umbilicus," he said in a tone of the most profound sorrow. They moved him upstairs later that day. The doctor who talked to him was afraid that he might hurt himself, and I was a little worried too. For the next 2 days, he sat strapped to a hospital bed, fighting sleep. He couldn't sleep, he told me, because he would have no way back without his umbilicus. I would be lost forever, and my consciousness would float forever in that void. He told me how he had told the thing behind the door that he would no longer write its story. I had assured him that it was all in his head, that it was a product of his imagination. When it had burst through the door and screamed, he knew it was all too real. He had run then, fled across the void, but the creature had wings and it had chased him. It defies description. Its legs were equine, its head like living rock. Its body was made of stars. I don't know, dear. Its mouth was full of fiery teeth, and when it lunged at me, I could do nothing but flee. As he had run, the thing had slashed at him. The clawed hand had torn at his umbilicus. Michael said a pain like a rending scythe had torn through his belly, and as he writhed, he could see the fiery teeth sever the root from him. He had caught the end then, using the last of his strength to grab the trailing end, and pulled himself out of the dark place, a little at a time. He was afraid after that, afraid to go back, afraid of what might be waiting there for him. He fought sleep for the next 3 days. He would nod and awaken, but it seemed harder for him to come back every time. He begged his doctor for caffeine pills, for coffee, for anything to keep him awake, but the doctors thought sleep would be the best drug for him. They fiddled with the idea of sedating him, but I forbade it. When they threatened to get the police involved, thinking I was somehow responsible for this, I threatened to call a lawyer. Finally, we reached a shaky standoff. It was moot after day 3. I lost the fight first, drifting off as I sat by his bedside. When I awoke, he was gone. He's in the ICU now. His coma is deep, and the doctors are afraid he might have suffered a stroke. They don't know about his nightly travels. Wouldn't believe me if I told them. But I know what's been happening to him. He's adrift in the void now, maybe already dead at the hands of this elder thing, and there's nothing I can do to get him back. But maybe there is something you all can do. My husband could not be the only one traveling to this place. Some of you must have heard the whispers through the door as well. If you see this door, and if you find my husband, please bring him back. I don't know how you would, but please try. And if the creatures on the other side of the door talk to you about things from the other side, please Do yourself a favor and listen to them. Don't ever stop listening to them. I wish I had never told him to stop listening. The price you pay for ignoring them might be your life. The price might even be steeper than that. I don't know about you guys, but that's where I always get my best writing ideas. That's why I'm usually sleeping. Coming up next, we have an artist struggling with her new art piece, or maybe struggling against it. Let's hear a story about the infinity table.
I've been an artist for a few years now. I went to school with people whose understanding of art stopped at watercolors and still lifes, but those never really were my thing. I like to be experimental in my work, really push the boundaries of art. My high school art teacher, Mr. Caff, never really understood that, but it's probably hard to understand much of anything with your head firmly crammed up your backside. He was one of those types who thought the Renaissance was the birth and death of the artistic expression, and that digital art was tantamount to blasphemy. He did not tolerate modern art in his classroom, and I likely wouldn't still be doing art if it wasn't for Terry. Terry and I met in art class freshman year, and we've been friends ever since. Terry is your textbook manic pixie dream girl, and her artistic medium is pop art, with a soft spot for comics. She did all those reimaginings of classic comic covers, always in heavy oils and deep, saturated colors, and her work is really something to behold. Mr. Caff may not have understood her medium, but he understood her process, so she made straight B's in his class. I have a theory that he was trying to get into her ripped blue jeans, but manic pixie dream girls rarely fall for the middle-aged high school teacher, so tough break teach. The old bastard tried to fail me, on the other hand, but I rose above it, and now I'm one of the most well-known modern artists in the city, likely to his chagrin. My art is far from what you'd consider classical. I make sculptures from various mediums, do charcoal prints, weird displays of paints and acrylics, and recently I've begun doing metalwork sculptures in something I'm calling transitory mundane. The basic premise is that you take something normal, a refrigerator or a couch or a TV, and make it utterly mind-blowing. My horror fridge took first place at last year's fall gala, and my TV apocalypse made the paper earlier this year. This time, however, I've got something really interesting in mind. Terry raised an eyebrow as I pulled the cover off my latest art project. I call it the Infinity Table. Terry looked dubiously at the rectangular living room table, a thick piece of glass sitting propped over a dark opening. It just looks like a regular table to me. I'm not sure what kind of concept you're going for, but I don't get it. I grinned as I leaned down, flicking a switch as the inside lit up to reveal the trick. Through mirror placement and strategic lighting, the inside of the table resembles nothing so much as a black pit that proceeds downward into infinity. A ladder was installed on the side and seemed to descend down into the pit. The mirror magnified it on and into the void. Terry's jaw dropped open as she oohed appreciatively over the illusion. The rocks on the walls and the crystal lighting, a really nice touch if I do say so myself. That is so cool. It's so simple yet intriguing. Everyone's going to want one after the show next week. But only one of them will get it. I think this may be my greatest art piece yet. The two of us cackled over my brilliance, and Terry told me about the panel series she planned to do for her own entry. Terry had been hard at work on an original comic series, so tired of bringing others' works to life and not getting to work on her own stuff. She was debuting a series of oil paintings from her own personal collection, and she hoped they would drum up some interest for upcoming series. I was listening, really I was, but my eyes kept being drawn back down to that yawning chasm that lay in the center of the table. It was an illusion. I knew it was an illusion. I had made it after all. But I couldn't keep myself from feeling the sightless black eye as it stared at me. It had discomforted me before, the way a scary movie makes you shiver even after it's over. But I always managed to shrug it off. I had created the illusion. I knew it wasn't real, but I could still swear that something lurked within it. I knew it didn't, but it still intrigued me. I was like a bird that knows the bag will trap him, but still wants to know what lies inside. Like a man who knows that the void stares back, but goes right on staring. Hello? Are you even listening to me? I shook myself back and apologized for spacing out. I flipped the light out on the table, and it was once again reduced to a black crater. Even turned off, I still felt like I could feel that inky mass looking at me, and I didn't like the crawling, scrabbling way it seemed to contemplate me. It had never looked at me like this during its creation, and it seemed to have gained a life of its own with its completion. It's cool and all, but I'm kind of glad you turned it off. I looked up as Terry shuddered, and the discomfort was an alien concept on her normally whimsical face. It scares me a little bit. I smiled, but I knew all too well what she meant. That's why Terry was my best friend. It was sometimes like we shared a brain. How did you even come up with something like this? She asked, still sounding equal parts terrified and amazed. I started to rattle off something about pure talent or the muse at work, but I honestly couldn't remember how I had thought of it. Had it been in a dream? It seemed like I had been inspired by something to build this piece, but I couldn't remember what. I had been so driven the last few weeks to finish it that I never really stopped to think why. Hello, you spacing out on me again? Terry laughed, snapping her fingers in front of my face. I shook my head, getting a grip before answering. Just the muse at work, I guess. I took her out for drinks then, wanting to forget about the feeling that dark eye had given me, as much as she did, but it was never far from my mind. When I stumbled back that night, the few drinks turning into a few too many drinks, I stood over the table and looked down into the dark, unlit eye. Even drunk, I felt the regard of that hateful space, and it sobered me a little. I could feel it staring at me through the flimsy haze that lay between us, and the dark hole seemed to long for its freedom again. I reached for the switch with a shaky hand, the mechanism snapping crisply as it came to life. The light came on, but it was cold comfort. The hole stretched into the earth, a dark and gaping maw that filled me with dread. Why had I created this thing? How did it occur to me to make such a hateful portal? How had I conceptualized this? The longer I looked into it, the more certain I became that I could see something at the bottom. It seemed to move within the dark eye, with frantic, herky-jerky movements. It moved like something in a claymation cartoon, and its regard was like wasps crawling on my skin. I didn't know what it was, couldn't even tell you how big it was, but as my hands trembled back towards the switch, I saw one thing for sure. It had begun to climb the ladder. The light snapped off with a smart pop, and I was left once more with only the dark haze across the glass. I went to bed, but my dreams were plagued by that bottomless eye and that thing that moved within. I didn't turn it on again until the day of the show. I honestly debated just pushing it into an alley behind my apartment and forgetting it ever existed, but I had too much time and money invested in the project to just walk away. The components hadn't come without a cost, and the prize money, not to mention the money I would make once it was sold, would allow me to do art for another few months. If it flopped at the show, I might have to actually find a job, and that would be the biggest blow to the art community imaginable. So I loaded it into the back of my ratty old pickup, the camper allowing it to ride in relative safety, and drove it to the gallery. I had secured it with a rope, not wanting it to tip over and break, despite my misgivings. I could tell myself that I kept checking the rear view the whole time just to make sure it wasn't getting damaged, but that was a lie. I wanted to make sure that nothing simply climbed out of it as I drove through the crowded streets of Seattle to what I hoped would be a feather in the cap of my career. My neighbor had helped me load the table. Beefy neighbors have to be good for something, right? And thankfully, there were burly men in black security shirts to help me unload it. They did most of the unloading and reloading onto the hand dolly, too, which was good because it had taken everything I had to put my hands on it as we loaded it into the truck. It had sat like a revered monolith in my living room for the past week. After I had woken up that first morning to a hangover and the sunlight illuminating the pit under that all-too-thin pane of glass, I had covered it with a tarp. I hadn't touched it, hadn't sat anything on it, hadn't even let my feet lean against it the whole week, and the thought of its surface against my skin made me feel crawly. I couldn't remember why I had been so excited about this thing, and only a feeling of deep revulsion filled me when I looked at it. If no one bought it, I had decided I would donate it to the gallery after the show. At least I could write that off on my taxes. Terry waved at me as she saw me coming in, and her little bird arms seemed ready to pop as she wrapped them around me. "I see you didn't get rid of it," she said with a smile, though her voice sounded strained.
Terry wouldn't say so, but she seemed to feel the same trepidation I felt around the piece. I figured that someone would buy it, and who knows, the judges might really like it. She showed me her prints, scenes of dramatic heroes poised for battle, and spiraling cityscapes that oozed adventure, and I made the appropriate noises over them. It was always impressive what she could do with oils and paints, but tonight she had really outdone herself. I gave her another hug, wishing her luck as I pushed my hateful table over to the area that had been designated for me. A passing pair of lost frat boys helped me get it off the dolly, and far too soon I was left alone with this blight upon the world. I didn't turn it on. I honestly didn't really want to look at it, and I just contented myself to stand there as people bustled by and set up their own pieces for the show. 20 minutes later, my mind wandering, someone called my name, and I turned to find a stern-faced woman looking down at my piece. "What is it?" she asked, a ribbon on her shirt letting me know that, though she wasn't a judge, she was still very important. The ribbon let everyone know that she was a contributor, the color putting her in a high tier. "It's called an infinity table," I told her, her scowl not impressed. I reached down, my fingers trembling, and flipped the switch. I expected to see an angry something looking back at me, the glass bearing long cracks where something had battered it from the other side. But instead, it was just the same dark eye as always. It regarded the two of us with an unfriendly familiarity, and the stern-looking woman looked impressed as she took it all in. Very interesting. Not my style, but very interesting. You should leave it on if you want anyone to buy it. The endless tunnel is a definite selling point. I waited for her to move away before switching it off again. She had a point. If I wanted to get rid of this hateful thing, I needed people to see what it could do. The fear of something climbing out of it seemed silly now, as all these people stood around me, but it was a silly feeling that wouldn't abate. In the end, my greed overrode my fear, and I flipped it on so I could draw in some interest. Interest I found. People came over to have a look, and there was a fair amount of oohing and awing. They asked how I had done it, wanted one of their own, but I told them it was a one-of-a-kind piece and would likely carry a steep price tag. All the while, my eyes kept flitting back to the crevice in the center of the table, as though I expected to see something crawl up from the depths. I could see, or at least I imagined I could see, the stunted figure as he stalked about at the bottom of the pit. It was trapped there. This was its prison, and now I had given it a means of escape. I had invited it out of the pit, and now it could come into our world, and wow, how did you ever come up with something so cool? I started. Someone new had come up to ask about the infinity table, and I told them again about the concept. It all sounded so false to me now. I hadn't come up with the concept, though I could certainly talk about it in an educated manner. What a smart little bird I was. I could talk oh so prettily about my new project, using all the right buzzwords and trendy lingo to catch all these yuppies' attention. I was an artist. I created art, but I was beginning to feel like something else. This was beginning to feel like I was being used. Despite these misgivings, the show was going pretty well. People loved the infinity table. They thought it was really cool and a great perspective piece. I had a few tentative offers, but nothing serious. I would have probably taken the first offer, but the hole in the table kept distracting me. As I talked to people, I could see the small something beginning to climb the ladder again. It was still very small, like a fly crawling on a window pane, but as it climbed, it got larger and larger with each rung it grabbed. There was no way this could be real. I had built the thing. There was no hole in the void. It was all an optical illusion. Even so, the small creature was climbing up and up and up as these stupid airheads talked on and on about how much they loved my table. "Hey, you okay?" I jumped, realizing I'd been staring at the table for nearly 5 minutes. Terry was there, a well-dressed man grinning on her arm. Terry wasn't tall, but this guy looked like he might have had some hobbits in his family tree. He was short, hairy, dressed in a luxury white suit with a gold chain and a lot of very aggressive chest hair. I wasn't certain I could smell him. There were a lot of sweaty bodies, mine chief among them, but there was a definite tang of musky cologne and fragrant soap. Terry was smiling, but the smile looked paper-thin as the man, whom I was already calling Leisure Suit Larry in my head, rubbed his arm against her hip. "This is Clive," she said, indicating Larry as she slid herself free of him. "He liked my art so much that he decided to buy all 5 pieces. I just knew he had to see your infinity table, so I brought him over here to have a look." Translation, Leisure Suit Larry was Loaded Larry, and she was hoping she could solve both our problems. Larry had sized me up as she spoke, and I could feel my skin crawl under his less than altruistic stare. I consider myself a lover of art, amongst other things. Did you make this? He asked, looking down into the table as his eyes seemed to dazzle as they took in the sight of the gaping pit. I did, I began, but before I could say anything else, I looked down at the table and felt my throat constrict. He was bigger now, the size of a thumbprint, and climbing fast. He was speeding up, climbing rapidly, and I wasn't sure how the others couldn't see him. Did they not see the shadowy little creature as it grew from a thumbprint to the size of a silver dollar? Larry was saying something, complimenting my work, but all I could focus on was the growing spot of black as it climbed like a mad thing. "I'm sold, love," he said to Terry, the word love making her flinch. "I'll pay you 30,000 for it." I couldn't speak. My throat was a stupid machine, incapable of doing anything but killing me slowly. The thing was twice as large now, growing quickly. I had no clue what I would do if it got to the glass and just started banging on that thin sheet of tempered material. Larry was looking right at it, his nose inches from the tabletop. How could he not see it? Playing hard to get, huh? Okay, 40,000 then. I could make out the top of its head, its face turned up to look at the land above. Its eyes were like twin coals, its mouth open in a leering grin, and its hands were covered in hair or tar or something. Its body was like an undiluted shadow, a golem of darkness that was climbing like a fiend to get at the lighted world above. It seemed like I might have unintentionally created performance art, I thought with a weak little gasp. Escape from purgatory in real life. Terry slid her hand into mine and squeezed, bringing me out of my panic. "What's wrong?" she whispered, seeing my face and sensing my fear. "You're a tease, aren't you?" Larry said, looking up from the table coyly. "Fine, but 50,000 is as high as I'll go, unless you agree to have drinks with me after the show. Then I might be willing to go up to 60. "Sold," I squeaked out, afraid he would take it all back and leave me with this thing. He extended a hand over the table. As I shook it, I could see the creature's face coming closer and closer to the top. I pumped his arm twice before bending down to snap the light off. Can you take it now?" I asked him, my voice sounding frantic even to my own ears. "Don't you want the judges to see it?" Terry asked, a little confused. The panel of 3 judges were just coming to the display area, but I didn't want this thing close to me for more than a second. The hell with the judges. The fear inside me was like a starving weasel, and I feared it would burst through my chest any minute. "Can you?" I asked again, looming over him. He nodded dumbly, taking out his checkbook and scrawling out a business check. I took it, and he pulled out his cell phone as he made some calls. He excused himself, and before Terry could ask any more questions, I pocketed the check and left the gallery. I met her later for drinks, and she said Larry had excused himself after the purchase. He said he wanted to get it loaded and set up in his own exhibition right away. I think you scared him with your intensity a little. We laughed about it then, my soul lighter now that I didn't have to look at that hateful table anymore. I hadn't thought about that table until yesterday, about a week and a half after the gala. The check had been cashed, and the money had easily floated my art career for the next few years. I'd paid some bills, paid my outstanding credit card debt, and began living pretty comfortably off the excess. I was sitting on my couch, watching Netflix and eating a bowl of cereal for dinner, when my phone buzzed. It was Terry. She had sent me a news article along with a message telling me that I should watch it. "Your art piece just made the news in New York," she told me, and the lack of emojis and lols made me a little wary. I opened it up to find an article about a murder at the gallery of Clive Foreman. The proprietor, Mr. Foreman, had been found dead in his gallery in Soho Tuesday morning. He appeared to have been drowned, though no water could be found in his lungs or on the ground around him. Doctors say it's as though he simply drowned on the floor of his gallery and was left there. The next picture was of a very familiar table. It had been broken, and the glass lay gaping and jagged like an untreated wound. The article went on to say that the murderer had left a message on the wall in either tar or some kind of oil, and as I scrolled to the next picture, I felt the phone slip out of my numb hand. The message on the wall seemed to glower at me from the floor. and I drew my knees up to my chest as I tried to make myself stop hyperventilating. It read, "Your muse is free. My prison is no more." One more story for you, and I promise we've got a good one to go out on. It's a story about a writer who keeps writing long after death, and how his family has to deal with it. It's called The Tapping of the Keys, and I hope you enjoy it.
My dad died nearly 2 years ago, and we just buried him today. He was a writer, though you've probably never heard of him. He was known in small circles, celebrated by the community where he lived, but his books will likely never grace the shelves of Barnes and Nobles. I say that like it's a fact, but that may not be the case anymore. Dad, much like one of those painters from the 1800s, became infinitely more famous in his death than he ever was in life. People who wouldn't return his calls, wouldn't even think of publishing his work, now come to see him from miles away. This probably seems strange, given that I just told you that he's dead, so let me start at the beginning. Dad died as he lived, at his keyboard. He's been writing the same book for as long as I can remember. It's a massive 7 or 8 volume series. In one of my earliest memories, I can remember toddling into his office and looking up at him as he smiled down at me, his fingers never leaving the keyboard as he plinked away. Dad wrote other things for magazines or freelance work, but the books were his magnum opus. He would tell anyone who would listen, usually interested friends of mine who were aspiring writers themselves, how the book would be the greatest work once it was done. He had envisioned 10 books in all, detailing the hero's journey of his main character as he attempted to find his father's murderer across several continents, meeting people and finding clues along the way. I've heard him talk about that book almost every day since I was old enough to understand what he was talking about, but I couldn't tell you much about them. He never let anybody read them. He was so protective of them. I don't know more than a dozen people who were aware of its existence at all. That being said, he was always in his study when he had time, tapping away at the keys and refining his manuscript for the day that it would be picked up by an editor. I was the one who found him, and it will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was getting ready for college, packing up my things, moving out, and I came to see if he would help me move some furniture onto the truck. He'd been in his office all day, and I kind of thought maybe he was mad at me. I know he didn't want me to leave. He was sad to see me go, but he had to understand that I had to go to college. I had a full-ride scholarship. I'd be a fool not to use it, and living on campus would give me access to resources I wouldn't have at home. It seemed like the best choice to move out, and I couldn't believe he couldn't see that. So when I stuck my head in and asked him, I was surprised when he didn't turn around. That only seemed to cement in my head the idea that he was mad at me. He had his back to the door, as he always did, fingers tapping away, and when he didn't say anything, I just stood there and looked at the back of his head for a moment. He had a bald spot forming, the hair receding away from the center, and I thought it was a little sad to watch my dad aging in such an obvious way. I asked him again, his fingers never slowing, but when he didn't say anything, I just went downstairs and managed to manhandle the desk into the U-Haul by myself. I decided I wouldn't bother him if he wanted to act like this. He would fold when it came time for me to leave, apologizing for acting like this, and we would have a hug before I drove off into the sunset. Around lunchtime, I looked at my now empty room and realized I was finished packing. Mom was at work at the post office, and I had planned to swing in and say bye on my way out of town. We had said our goodbyes that morning, with a lot of tears and hugging over breakfast, and Dad was the only one I still needed to say goodbye to. So I went upstairs again, saying I needed to leave and wondering if he'd give me a hug. His fingers just kept tapping away uninterrupted. "Come on, Dad," I said, stepping inside as he continued to ignore me. "I know you're bummed about this, but it's time for me to get out of here and make my own way. It's not like I'll never see you again. I'll be here for Thanksgiving. That's less than..." But when I put my hand on his shoulder, I noticed how cold it was. Dad had been up here for 3 days writing, and Mom said she didn't think he'd come to bed in all that time. That wasn't uncommon for Dad. He would hyperfixate on a project, or revisions for days at a time. His office was towards the back of the house on the second floor, so without foot traffic or noise, he could lose himself for days as he worked. He usually came down for food after everyone was asleep, but I couldn't remember hearing him stumble around lately. I turned him towards me, his hands moving comically in front of him as he swung away from the desk, and as he came away, he began to scream as if someone was stabbing him. I stumbled away, taking in his long face and sunken eyes, and found myself running from the room as I grabbed the phone out of my pocket. Mom said she'd be home immediately, and as I waited downstairs, I could still hear him screaming in his office. She came home in a rush, going up the stairs 2 at a time, and when the screaming finally stopped, I breathed a sigh of relief. When she came downstairs, she asked me to come to his office. I need to talk to you about something, and I think this should be a family decision. I came back to see that Dad was still staring at the screen of his MacBook, tapping away like we weren't even there. I don't know how to explain this, but your father's dead. Looking at his fingers as they went about their tireless typing, I asked if she was kidding. Dad was clearly alive. His hands were moving, and I could see words on the screen forming coherent sentences. Were they playing a joke or something? None of what she was saying made any sense. I checked his pulse. He has no pulse, no vitals. He's gone, sweetie. But it appears that he's not quite gone. She tried to move him, and as she turned him away from the computer, I could see his lifeless face as it turned to regard me. His jaw had been hanging slack, his eyes open and staring, and as his hands came away from the keyboard, he started screaming all over again. It was deep and tortured, similar to the one he'd made before, and without even meaning to, I turned him back to the keyboard where his hands started typing again. I asked her what was going on, and Mom shrugged as she tried to come up with a reason for this. His book was important to him. You know that. I think maybe once he finishes it, he might stop on his own. I can't explain what's happening here, but I don't want him to die with his work unfinished. Your father kept saying it wasn't ready, but I'm going to send the first manuscript to his editor. Maybe once he sees it and someone puts it into print, he'll finally be able to rest. Either way, let's keep this between us, okay? I want your father to pass on without regrets, don't you? I nodded, telling her of course I did. I wanted Dad to die in peace. Then do him this last favor, and don't tell anyone what you've seen here. Promise? I really didn't know how to feel about this, but I told her I wouldn't tell anyone, and she thanked me as she hugged me goodbye. I left in my U-Haul, unsure how to feel about the situation, but I kept the secret. I didn't come home for the next year. I came home for Thanksgiving, as promised, but the whole thing felt uncomfortable. Mom and I sat downstairs eating, her curious about how school was going, and me filling her in on my studies. As I ate turkey and tried to have a normal conversation over stuffing, all I could focus on was the tap-tap-tapping from upstairs. Mom had closed the door to Dad's office, something that I could never remember happening at any time in my life. But despite her best efforts, the tapping was still audible. There was a smell from the room at the end of the hall, and I was worried about her living in a house with a decomposing body. She said he hadn't decomposed much, but I think she might have been trying to spare my feelings. Worse than the smell, though, was the tapping. It never stopped. It sounded too loud to be from whole fingers. Despite this, Mom was in pretty good spirits. She said that Dad's first book was being edited, and his publicist thought it was likely to be ready for shelves by next year. He couldn't believe my dad had been keeping this gem to himself for so long, and I think that's when I really realized how few people Dad had shared his book with. She said the initial payment on the book had allowed her to pay some overdue bills, and she would send him the second book sometime next year. If I release them slowly, it won't seem so odd when he finishes, and I let them know that he's passed. I asked if his writing had slowed at all, and she said that he was typing all day and night. He never rests, and I've had to start sleeping in my noise-canceling headphones. The sound takes some getting used to, but I think I can put it out of my mind. I had meant to stay the week, but I ended up making excuses and leaving the day after Thanksgiving. The sound of the keys as they clicked away was becoming too much for me to handle. After that, I made excuses not to come home. I told Mom I had a paper due during Christmas and stayed on campus over the holiday. I took extra classes so I didn't have to come home on the semesters that I'd be able to take a break from. I still called her on the phone, but our conversations became shorter and shorter as time went on. The longer I was on the line with her, the more pervasive the clicking became, and it felt like I could hear it over the phone no matter where she was. Mom's mental state began to deteriorate as well. She'd sent the second book to his publicist, and he'd fast-tracked it after the first one had done so well. She deflected any sort of interviews or phone calls for Dad, telling them how shy and anxious he was. But people really seemed to want to pick his brain about the direction of the books, and they were becoming harder and harder to put off. She didn't sound like her usual self either. It was clear that she wasn't sleeping. She said the clicking was getting louder and louder the longer it went on. I tried to do some soundproofing on the office, but it never seems to help. I can't stand to be in there for very long. Even though he's looking at the screen, I can feel him watching me when I'm in there. I think I can hear something moving around at night, too. Mom took a deep breath, and I could almost see her looking in the direction of the office as she pitched her voice lower. I asked what she meant, afraid that maybe animals had gotten in to try to get at Dad's body. But she said it was just little sounds. You remember how he used to leave his office late at night to get food? Sometimes I feel like I can hear someone coming down the stairs in the wee hours of the morning. While I was listening to it the other night, I realized that I couldn't hear the keyboard anymore, and that scared me even more. She started crying then, and I think I had already decided to come home that weekend so we could sort this out. I hadn't come home in a long time, and I found a very different woman than the one I had found over Thanksgiving a year before. And why not? It had to be nerve-wracking, knowing you were sharing a house with a corpse. Mom looked like she had aged 20 years. Her hair, light blonde the last time I'd seen it, was threaded with gray and looked thinner than ever. Her skin sagged, and her eyes looked bruised from the bags under them. She was so thin to the point of emaciation, and I wondered if she had been eating. When she hugged me, I could feel her ribs pressing against me, and I decided then that something had to be done before I lost both my parents. I told her that we had to end this. I told her that we had to put him to rest, but she feebly resisted. He isn't done yet. He's still typing up there. I can't lay him to rest until he's finished. I asked her how long that would be, but she didn't seem to have an answer. I told her I was tired and wanted to rest, but after I heard her door close and the sound of her springs grumbling as she went to bed, I got up and went downstairs. I wanted to see what this thing was that was moving around after dark, and I knew just the place to hide. There was a small closet in the living room, a place for wrapping paper and old crafts Mom hadn't gotten around to yet. And after sliding some things around, I made myself comfortable and cracked the door. It took some time. I wished I had some coffee to keep me from dozing in the small, warm place. I was just starting to nod off, my phone showing 3:30 in the morning, when the landing at the top of the stairs creaked. Something glided down almost soundlessly, its body light as I pressed my eye to the slit in the door to see what it was. It was dark in the living room, the curtains drawn, but I didn't dare turn on my light. If it knew I was here, it might flee, and then I'd have nothing to report to Mom in the morning. Luckily for me, it jostled right past the closet door, and the creature was impossible to miss. It was thin, almost lacking dimensions, creaking as it ambled into the kitchen. I held my breath as it disappeared into the dim space, but the pale head was hard to miss. When it turned to look at the closet from the kitchen doorway, I feared I'd made a noise. When those empty eye sockets fixed on the door, I covered my mouth with my hands. When the creature creaked its way into the kitchen and disappeared from sight, I tripped out of the closet and made my way less than gracefully back up the stairs and into my old room. If it heard me, it didn't stop at the door to comment. Only then did I come to the same conclusion that my mother had, realizing what was missing from the silent house. The tapping had stopped. We called the police the next day, me threatening to call them myself if Mom didn't. I didn't know what that thing was I'd seen the night before in the kitchen, but I couldn't very well leave her alone with it. She just nodded and picked up the phone. I think she was ready to call them, honestly. She lived with Dad's corpse for 2 years, and even she had to agree it was time to end it. The paramedics weren't sure what to make of him, but he was definitely what I had seen the night before when it came into the kitchen. He had almost completely rotted, but his bones had moldering flesh still attached in places. His scalp had some hair clinging to it. The bald spot I had noticed was still visible, but we had taken his hands off the keyboard before they got there. When we had taken him from the computer, his scream was little more than a wheeze of protest. He had no vocal cords to scream with, but still, he protested. The police had questions, but I think Mom managed to convince them that it was all harmless. She said that when he died, she had just gone a little bit crazy. She couldn't cope with him being gone, so she just pretended he was in his office, typing away on his novel. I told them that that was what she had told me for months, and I think they believed me. Dad's remains were taken to the funeral home, and it goes without saying that his funeral was a closed casket affair. As we sat on the front row, though, I heard something that would haunt me until I went into the ground myself. Dad may not have been able to scream, but it seemed his work went on regardless. As I sat there with Mom, my mother sobbing as she heard the all-too-familiar sound, we both heard the low tapping of those bony fingers smacking against the lid of the coffin. I can only assume that they still press against the lid even now, my father's last story worn into the wood of his coffin.
And just like that, our stories are at an end for another day. But we'll be back tomorrow with more great stories on Cozy Horror. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.